people fail to appreciate environmental history and getting that into the general discussion of history. And as you suggested in an interview recently, are environmental historians maybe more comfortable being out there in their own area and just working in that area alone?
Yeah, I think that environmental history, which really began to make its name in the 1970s, it has roots earlier than that, as you suggested. It really began to make its name studying the kinds of things that I had mentioned before. Agriculture, people actually living on the land and dealing with forests and animals and things like that. As it's developed, as this field has developed, people have begun to push it into other areas that I think people, environmental historians back in the 1970s, weren't thinking about. So it's a very interesting thing. Some environmental historians now, for example, are moving into the Civil War. Lisa Brady's recent book, War Upon the Land, is a good example of that, and I think I'm part of that general movement. And it asks a basic question about, you know, the role and place of nature in human life, and if it's important to us, if no thing is ever outside of the natural world, how does that look when you start asking that question of icons of American history, such as Abraham Lincoln? So that was really the how I got going on the book, and an important motivation for the book was an experience that I had in teaching my American environmental history class. And that class was structured along the conventional lines of the kind of topics that we've been talking about. But one day after class, a couple students came up to me and they said, "This is American history, right?" And I said, "Well, that's right." And they said, "Well, then how come we're not learning about the usual topics?" And the two topics they mentioned were the American Revolution and the Civil War. And what I said to them was, well, when you look at environment as a theme, other kinds of things come out and become more salient: disease, climate, soil, those sorts of things. And events that we usually consider to be important to recede in the picture. But I had to admit to them, if the premise of environmental history is correct, if nature is important to human life in all aspects, then I probably should have something to say about topics like the Civil War. And that's really what prompted the book. That was in the late 1990s. I'm sorry I don't remember the names of those two students. They were wonderful. they prompted me to take up this project. But that got me started. And from there, then I began to think about, well, what are some interesting topics that people would really know something about, that I could then unpack, so to speak, and explore them as examples of environmental history, moments, very important moments, iconic moments in the canonical American story that, when you dig into them, have something to do with nature.
Yeah. Well, let's address one of them right now, and we'll go back to the beginning of the story and early in United States history. The Salem witch trials. We've always interpreted that as a human event, and it certainly was. But you write a great chapter of looking at, well, how is nature driving that? Could you comment on that a little bit, on the Salem witch trials?
Sure. In many ways, the Puritan colonists were trying to establish an order. It was both a social order, an ordered society, but also had an ordering of the landscape itself. That order was very important to them. They struggled mightily to establish it and maintain it. But of course, they live in a world in which things are very unstable, and the natural world itself, the landscape, is inherently unstable. And it was the instability of the land, the instability of environmental circumstances that began to upset that order. And it was in that space between the desire for the order and the upset of that order that caused them to wonder what was going on. And it was in that moment that they began to imagine supernatural forces in the land. And the supernatural forces can range from God himself. There's a kind of providentialism to Puritan thought, European thought, but it also ranges down to the idea that there are malign supernatural forces, that Satan would be at work in the land, and Satan was responsible for the kinds of things that were happening to them, whether it was the deaths of livestock, the unexpected, inexplicable, or seemingly inexplicable deaths of livestock, things that happened to people themselves, storms, crop failures, and so forth. What's going on there? And there was a strain in Puritan civilization that imagined that it was the work of malign forces, including witches, same as minions.
It touches on the theme that we wish to manipulate and control nature.
Yes.
We do right now, and when we can't, we look for excuses.
We look for excuses.
And sometimes it's in the other guy. Usually it's in the other guy, not in us.
That's right.
I want to bring this. Let's bring our guy back into it again, because you talk about Lincoln. Chapter title for the Lincoln title. Lincoln chapter is Nature's Nobleman.
Nature's Nobleman.
Right. Who was the source of calling him Nature's Nobleman?
Well, the term Nature's Nobleman was applied to Lincoln by his supporters in the campaign of 1860, and I think it is a very telling, revealing term. We don't typically think of Lincoln as Nature's Nobleman. We usually think of him as being the rail splitter, the great emancipator, those kinds of labels. But here, back in 1860, many of his supporters were calling him Nature's Nobleman.
And one of the ways you get into talking about Lincoln is you look at an essay or speech that he wrote that Lincoln scholars have often put off to the side as it's non-political, so it's of less importance in his life, and he gave a speech about improvements and inventions, 1856, maybe around that period, when he was also doing political speeches. You look into this and you actually see into his substance. What he is and what he writes about inventions and improvements. And an improvement is the term you use to get in there. I want to ask you about that in a second. But I want to start by showing you an artifact of nature and humanity that illustrates Lincoln, and it's one of the things we have here. This is the Patent Office report of 1849 and 1850, mechanical. A very typical prosaic government catalog. And when we turn to page number 262, patent number 6469, an improved method of lifting vessels over shoals by A. Lincoln. President Lincoln is the only U.S. president to hold a patent. And this is simply the catalog, the government catalog of Lincoln's patent. There's a nice, this is very small, but I'm going to hold it up, a nice diagram of the little, they might call it a cameling invention, something to lift a boat over a shoal if it is stuck there. Mark provides another terrific illustration of it in the book, and we'll look at it right there. So Mark, without actually, if you want to talk about the invention, that's great, but what he's talking about, and what you see right in the title of his invention, improvement. Improvement. What does improvement mean to Abraham Lincoln, and how does that concept in him lead to the Lincoln that we know and the things he did historically?
Well, of course, Lincoln is a man of the land. He's a guy who works in the land. He's a boatman. He's a guy who is the rail splitter. He works with axes. He does a lot of physical labor, and that's one of the ways that I depict him as a guy who's emerging from the landscape. He gains a sense of self through those kinds of activities. And in many ways, I think it's because of the hard physical labor that he did, is he becomes very interested, deeply interested in innovations and inventions, new technologies that lift those kinds of burdens from ordinary labor. And so the document, Lincoln's patent, is for flotation devices that would lift a steamboat over shoals and allow it to proceed on its way. And this is a guy who did worked as a riverboatman and actually physically struggled to get the riverboats over obstacles.
Right, he had the famous interaction at New Salem. The first time the people at New Salem saw him, he was saving a flatboat from turning over the mill dam.
Yeah, from getting hung up on the mill dam. So he's very interested in discoveries and inventions. And then sometime in the early 1850s, he composes a speech, which he gave a number of times to paying audiences, his speech on discoveries and inventions. And it's a fascinating speech, and it is basically, what he tries to do is to collapse all of human history into an account of what he would call technological progress. Mm-hmm. It's how humankind encounters obstacles and then invents things out of its world, out of nature, so to speak, in order to better its circumstances. And one of the things he calls this is improvement. And there's all kinds of things that he gets at in there. It really begins with the invention of clothing, the invention of language, the improvement of agriculture, and so forth. And for Lincoln, and I think this was a very important part of my exploration of Lincoln and my discovery of some aspects of his thought, was that improvement had a precise meaning, and it was a meaning that I think we've lost today. And improvement meant the fulfillment of nature's potential to nurture and sustain human life and a republican form of government. Mm-hmm. And part of this was the working in the material world, the physical world, outside of the human body. It meant discovering and inventing things. Mm-hmm. But it also entailed a kind of self-improvement, that the people themselves, humanity itself, was part of nature. And oftentimes in Lincoln's way of thinking, these two things went together. The improvement of an external nature, inventing things, working on the land. What was essential to this was a kind of self-improvement. And the example that I give in the book, which I think is very interesting, is that of surveying. Mm-hmm. Surveying the land was a way of systematically ordering it so that people could create property in it and work it, agriculturally produce on it. But at the same time, to do this kind of work, Lincoln had to engage in a kind of self-improvement, which was learning mathematics and learning how to use survey instruments. Mm-hmm. People who study cognition now know that when you engage in that kind of learning, there's actually, they're minute, but there are physical changes to your brain. Mm-hmm. So the human nature is being changed, it's being improved upon at the very time that you're improving this landscape and you're ultimately furthering the ends of the Republic.
Mm-hmm. So Lincoln, as I understand your view of Lincoln, Lincoln considers improvement to be a natural phenomenon, and therefore seems to also think that something that inhibits improvement is unnatural. Do you read it that way? Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I would say that it's or that there are different propensities in human nature. You know. Mm-hmm. That's where improvement starts to have, mm-hmm. It starts to explain the world less well for Lincoln. Mm-hmm. Lincoln did have he had his own sense of providentialism. Mm-hmm. When the war comes, he wrestles with the notion of improvement. What does this mean for the idea of improvement? Mm-hmm. The war is antithetical to improvement. Mm-hmm. Nothing is more antithetical to improvement than a battlefield strewn with dead bodies. Mm-hmm. And he has to try to wrestle with that and somehow explain it. And in his mind, it becomes an expression of God's inscrutable will. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a providentialism to it. But nonetheless, he never gives up on mm-hmm. the possibility of improvement. And I think for him, the war becomes a means of reopening that possibility. Mm-hmm. If we can get past this, we can get back on track with the way the country had been before the conflict started.